This is a story about missing people, except it's really a story about Bigfoot. Except it's really a story about feral people. I'm Aiden Mattis, and welcome back to the... Where are we?
Lore?
Oh, the Lore Lodge. Every time we do a Missing 411 video, we get at least one comment from somebody saying, if you're going to use David Paulides' work, you could at least credit him, and then trying to call us frauds or, scammers or grifters or any sort of number of terms. And often my replies to those comments are along the lines of, when we do use Paulides' work, we cite him. We just usually don't use Paulides' work. This video is one of the times where we used Paulides' work, and I really did not want to, but unfortunately that was kind of the only option here. Now, why is that the only option? Well, because Ron Morehead and his buddies talked to David Paulides about things they didn't publicly talk to other people about. So, Paulides' interviews as a first primary source here are kind of one of the best pieces of information to have. That said, Paulides' interviews do sort of contradict other stuff that the very people he's interviewing said at other times, so I'll get into those contradictions and why I think that they're honestly not that important. But you know what is important? Having a good lawyer. You see, last year I was attacked by Bigfoot and left absolutely broken in many ways, but nobody could help me find somebody to represent me in court. And more importantly, nobody could find Bigfoot. I was at a complete loss. But that's when somebody told me about Morgan & Morgan. Injured and don't know where to start? With Morgan & Morgan, it is so easy. Since my body was destroyed in multiple places, I had a little bit of trouble getting around. But with Morgan & Morgan, you can submit a claim without ever having to get off the couch. That's right, in 8 clicks or less, you can submit a claim to Morgan & Morgan. For more information, go to forthepeople.com or dial #law. That's #529 from your cell phone. But as the title of this video suggests, we're talking about the Sierra Camp tapes, and if you've never heard the Sierra Camp tapes, we'll show you some of the sounds. But what's important to recognize here before we get to that segment of the video is exactly how isolated the area in which these recordings were taken is. It's up in the Sierra Nevada mountains, a little bit north of Yosemite, according to the interview that Paulides had with Morehead, somewhere between Yosemite and Lake Tahoe. I'd say the biggest reason that Paulides gives for including this segment, because it's not really a story about missing people, the reason is that it's very close to a cluster of missing people. So with that in mind, we then have to talk about what's actually going on here. And in the Missing 411 The Hunted documentary, Paulides even includes a little caption at the beginning of this segment saying that the only reason he is reporting on this is because there is physical documentary evidence that it occurred. But according to Ron Morehead, the man who was interviewed by Paulides for this story, the camp sits at about 10,000 feet. It's 8 miles up from the nearest trailhead and the nearest road, and that actual spot they start at is about 6,000 feet in elevation. So about a 4,000 foot elevation climb. And this is not that they're hiking up a trail. This is true wild camping. They're just out in the wilderness. Based on that elevation, this camp would be somewhere between Bridgeport, California, and Calaveras Big Trees State Park in California. So I went and I looked at the topographical map of this region of California and tried to ascertain, all right, which of these ridges could they have been camping on? But there are a lot of 10,000 foot ridges. And as you'll learn a little bit later in this video, there are even more 8,500 foot ridges, and that's an important detail. So I was really unable to pick any specific location for this. You just really can't do it. But according to Morehead, there is no trail to their campsite. They find it by orienteering and memory. So the whole goal was that nobody else would actually find their spot, and they don't want to tell people the exact location because they don't want it becoming a tourist destination. They want to keep that land wild so that they and their descendants can continue to hunt on it and the area can remain the beautiful natural area that it is. Now, the area itself is surrounded by freshwater springs, ridges, trees, boulder fields, and all sorts of animal life. The route and the camp fall within the lower montane and the upper montane biotic zones, which means that they're home to mule deer, black bear, the occasional mountain lion, and a large number of smaller critters. And according to Ron, the camp had been there since the 1950s, but he started making trips up to it in 1971. And 1971 is when he started to hear sounds out in the woods. And not just the sounds of, someone stumbling across a branch, not the sounds of a coyote howling in the distance. These were chattering sounds. They were whoops and whistles and what almost had the cadence of speech. When he and his buddies would hear these noises, they would go and hide inside of the wooden shelter they had constructed. And if you listen to the interview that Paulides does with Morehead, he really does sound like, or he at least suggests that they were genuinely afraid back then. That any minute they'd hear something just thrust its arm through and grab one of them or something like that. But none of the times that they heard these sounds involved anything coming that close to the camp. And eventually, they invited their buddy Al Berry up to the camp. He was a reporter from Sacramento, and he brought a camera and tape recorder and all of that with him so that they could get a good idea what they were actually listening to by recording it and then listening to it later. And the first time I heard these tapes, it was when I was watching Missing 411 The Hunted, the documentary. I replayed it several times, and before I give my analysis of it, I'm gonna have it play for you so you can decide what you think. So we're gonna toss that up on the screen right now. Listening back to those tapes myself, I hear 2, maybe 3 or 4 voices that are coming from outside of the shelter. Clearly, Morehead and Berry are responding to some of these sounds, but what really gets me is the fact that they're not animal sounds. You know, they're not just a growl or a bark or a howl. There's some chattering in there, some gibberish. You know, there's a mix of some hooting sounds, some laughter, some growling, and then interspersed within it, there's a number of occasions where you almost get like the cadence of speech, just not in any recognizable language. It kind of seems to me like there is some sort of conversation going on between these unseen figures, these unseen, what sound like people almost, and then that they hear Morehead and Berry mimicking them, and then they call back. So there's something going on there. And that's not to say that only human beings can do call and response. If I make the same sounds that my dog makes, he then makes sounds back, and we have a conversation. But it's not, this is different from that. Now, at this point in the story, I feel it is important to tell you that both David Paulides and Ron Morehead have published books advocating for the existence of Bigfoot. And while Paulides does not at any point in any Missing 411 documentary say Bigfoot is responsible for this, he does seem to be a believer, and there does seem to be a bit of a twinge of, you know, Bigfoot is real to his videos. If it were just David Paulides and Ron Morehead saying, yeah, this sounds like it could be a squatch, I would not take them seriously. But it's not just Ron Morehead and David Paulides saying that, because Morehead or Berry or someone with access to the tapes had the foresight and the wisdom to actually send them in for analysis by scientists. And the analysis was published in a book called Man-Like Monsters on Trial, which is discussion of humanoid monsters like goblins, elves, Sasquatch, the Wendigo, all of those wonderful things. According to the analysis in the book, which is of course an actual compilation of scientific documents, Dr. Lynn Kirlin determined that there was something odd here. And I'm going to change some details of the story now based on what's in the book from 1972, not just the recollection from the 2010s. According to the book, Al Berry recorded those sounds on October 21st, 1972, so about a full year after Ron Morehead started going up to the camps. Now, is this because Morehead heard the sounds and then eventually called Berry? Who knows? But that seems like the most likely option here, is that they were hearing the sounds, then he, called a buddy who had the equipment to come up and record it. According to that document, the event actually transpired at 8,500 feet, not 10,000, 2,000 feet higher than the nearest road, and 8 miles from the nearest established trail. Not just trailhead, 8 miles from the nearest trail. Now, while that does deviate somewhat from the description given in Missing 411 The Hunted, it's close enough. Maybe they said the camp was at 10,000 feet and they were just kind of, throwing out a number. It's actually 8,500, and they gave more accurate details to the scientific team than they gave to Paulides. Maybe over the years he just forgot how high up they were at the time. Who can really say? It's also possible that the reason he gave Paulides the number 10,000 feet was to prevent people from coming to look at the actual site at 8,500 feet. If you send them on the wrong coordinates, then they're never going to find the actual spot. And to be clear, this was neither the first nor final recording of these sounds, sounds, but it was the one with the highest fidelity. You could actually tell that there were sounds out in the wilderness and they didn't need to be isolated on the tape. You could just play it and analyze that. And what Dr. Kirlin came up with is a number of observations, including a wide range of vocalization, much of which shows a human-like level of articulation. So what he's saying there is, this sounds like human speech patterns, not just animal noises. However, while the team were not audiologists or speech pathologists or anything, they did, and I'm going by their words here, I'm paraphrasing, they did have the necessary skills to interpret signal processing, including speech. And again, 1972. So you're not dealing with quite the high-tech equipment you have today. And I'm about to say some things that I don't know what they mean. So have fun with that. They used formant frequencies. Don't know what that is. According to the scientists, the formant frequencies were an indication of the size of the vocal tract and were used extensively to determine what was going on here. So, what exactly did they determine from that? Dr. Kirlin, who was then an associate professor of electrical engineering at the University of Wyoming, had some thoughts. According to him, the tapes displayed a vocal range that was broader than the average human. The tapes displayed no clearly identifiable speech, more of a vocalization than a verbalization. And to quote Kirlin here, the possibility of more than one speaker, or even species, should be explored. He goes on to say, estimates of both pitch and vocal tract length are extracted from segments on the tapes. Information is displayed via scattergram of pitch versus length, which allows easy visual comparison with human data. What does that mean? It means that they threw this graph up here and extrapolated from it things that I never possibly could because I don't know what this graph means. Now, of those observed speech patterns, so to speak, much of them fell outside the human range of vocal capabilities. A sound that they classified as who fell entirely outside of the range. A sound that they classified as gob gob fell within the range of just over half the time. And again, the range being the normal range of a human male. The vocalization classified as moitail fell nearly just within human range, so kind of at the edges of what humans could produce. A sound classified as ugun fell primarily inside the human range, but very importantly to all of this, a sound that the team classified as grr, or a growl, fell entirely outside of the normal human range. And when they decided to change from an average human male to a particularly deep-voiced human male profile, the grrs still fell outside of the normal human range. So, from this, Kirlin and his associates determined that the data suggested a longer vocal tract than a human would possess. Based on the data they had, the estimated height for the individual making these sounds was between 6'4" and 7'3", if you include the entire spectrum of data. But if you isolate down to just the grr sounds, you get a much taller person, between 7'4" and 8'2". For our non-American viewers, that's about 2.5 meters. So this suggests an individual of truly immense size. There are only 2,800 people in the world, according to the CDC, who are over the height of 7 feet. For context, the average American man is 5'9". Now, statistically, it is possible that you could find somebody, say at LAX at the airport, who is 7 feet tall. That wouldn't be unbelievable. But finding one of those less than 3,000 people in the world who are that big, out in the wilderness, in the mountains, 8 miles off the nearest trail at 8,500 feet, 2,000 feet higher than the actual road near it, seems less than probable. And as I said, even accounting for a man with a particularly deep voice, those grr sounds still suggested a person much larger than your average human being. Another important factor here is that the analysis determined that using the technology available at the time, it was nearly impossible that these tapes had been edited, faked, altered in any way. And again, I'm not totally sure how to explain the process here, but I'm gonna do my best to reflect what was written in the book. One of the immediate questions was, oh, well, is this just human speech that was pre-recorded and then played backwards? So they played the tapes backwards, and what they determined was not in any known language. They also determined that because the growling sounds were pitch consistent regardless of estimated vocal tract length, tape speed alteration was unlikely. If they had altered the tape speed, then the pitch consistency would change. One of the lines from the actual study itself reads, "The listener could well imagine two creatures conversing." And on top of that, while there is no documented evidence that I could find, Barry and Morehead claim that the next morning they found 3 distinct sets of foot tracks. Another interesting piece of information here is that while the vocal tracks did seem to be longer than human beings, based on the sounds made, like that gob gob, there are certain sounds that can only be made by certain shapes of vocal tract. In this case, the shape seemed to be similar to that of a human based on the sounds produced. According to the document itself, a longer vocal tract, but with 2 vocal cavities like that of a human being. They go on to say that assuming only one vocalizer, so one person recording all of these sounds, so that they can then be edited in later, time-varying tape speed is necessary to produce data over such a wide range. But as we have previously noted, there was no evidence of time speed alteration. In fact, there was evidence to the contrary. And then, outside of the grunts and growls and speech patterns, there was also the whistling. And to again quote the paper, both typical human and some abnormal whistle types were found. Very short vocal tract lengths were estimated. They go on to say, these could either have been produced with some kind of musical instrument or by the creature using only a part of its vocal tract. But what they were certain of, based on those sounds, is that it could not be a normal human's vocal cords. So, according to the science, Al Berry, on those tapes, seems to have recorded a very large, exceptionally large person or set of people conversing. To reiterate here, 0.000038% of people are even 7 feet tall, let alone 8 feet tall. So this leads us to the natural conclusion that it must be Bigfoot. No, we're not stopping there. It's not that simple. Come on, you're in the Lore Lodge. We're gonna talk about Bigfoot now. And we're gonna talk about how likely it is that these guys actually came across Bigfoot. Now, to get into that, though, we have to really talk about what Bigfoot is, but we're going to start by, again, giving a disclaimer here that David Paulides has published books suggesting that Bigfoot exists, outside of the Missing 401 series. Ron Morehead runs a Bigfoot research website. He is very much of the opinion that Bigfoot is real, and we've got to be aware of that when examining these tapes. That out of the way, what's Bigfoot? The term itself, as applied to this specific phenomenon, comes from the 20th century, from 1958, when a man named Jerry Crew started noticing some weirdness around his worksite. Jerry, while working for a logging company in Humboldt County, California, came across a track of 16-inch long humanoid footprints. They were up in Six Rivers National Forest, so of course yet another national park or forest, and what they were looking at, though they didn't have, they didn't see a creature, but they saw these footprints and they were like, hey, that's a Bigfoot. And thus the term Bigfoot was born, and that's why you don't see a ton of Bigfoot stuff until the 1960s. All of those early grainy videos of some giant ape walking around and looking back at the camera and seeming all funky like, I'm sure Aiden can find one of those videos. There are several famous ones that we could probably play right now.
Look for no good, I'm a shooter. What the crap?
What was that?
Did you see that?
Yeah.
Those start popping up in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. But legends regarding the creature we've come to see as Bigfoot go back a hell of a lot farther than that. And we're going to use the account given to one of my favorite historical figures, Theodore Roosevelt, for this one. Because in The Wilderness Hunter, a book that came out in 1889 or 1893, depending on which source you look at, he describes not his own encounter, but he retells a story given to him by a man named Bauman. And Roosevelt, to be clear, refers to this as a goblin story. Not a Bigfoot story, not a Sasquatch story, not a Wendigo story, just a goblin story. And if you go and you look this story up, you're going to find certain versions of it that say it's called the Wendigo and that's what it's about, but I think that might be just a misunderstanding. Now, Roosevelt is, of course, the godfather of American conservationism. He is the guy who started the National Forest Service, though he was not the guy who started the first national park. That was Yellowstone, and it was long before he was ever in power. But the National Park Service was a product of the National Forest Service. So what happened to Bauman? Well, his story takes place on the Idaho-Montana border as he and a companion are going and trapping up along some rivers. At Wisdom River, they were not having very much luck, so they decided to head up into a nearby pass that was known for having a lot of beaver. However, the pass had a dark reputation because the previous year, a hunter had been found killed and half-eaten by a group of local prospectors. Not totally strange. If you're off hunting alone, you could get attacked by a mountain lion, by a bear, by a pack of wolves. Any number of things could happen. But still, it had an evil reputation as a result. Now, Bauman and his unnamed partner, of course, had ridden ponies up into the mountains because that was, an easier way to do things. But they got to a point where the terrain was not suitable for horses, dismounted, tied them off, left them with some food, and decided to head up into the pass for a couple of days. According to Roosevelt's story, Bauman and his partner hiked for another 4 hours and then set up camp in a clearing they came across. They were left with another hour and a half or two of daylight and spent that time exploring the creek and setting up traps so that they could spend the next day just checking traps and setting further traps. However, upon returning to their camp, they were surprised to find that it appeared a bear had ransacked it. The lean-to shelter they had constructed was destroyed, their belongings were scattered about, and it just kind of looked like something had come in and just torn the place up. And, most importantly, there were tracks everywhere, but they were too busy cleaning up and getting ready for the evening to actually check what they were. They just assumed it had been a bear because it looked like it had been a bear. But once everything was settled and it had started to get dark, as Bauman was preparing dinner, his partner went and got a closer look at those tracks. He grabbed some burning sticks out of the fire and used those for light, and just very carefully inspected this trail up and down a couple of times before returning to Bauman and saying, "Bauman, that bear has been walking on 2 legs." To this, Bauman immediately laughed because that's ridiculous, but upon inspecting the tracks himself, he determined that, yeah, it really looked like this bear was walking on 2 legs. To be clear, bears can stand on 2 legs, bears can walk on 2 legs. But, according to Yellowstone Bear World, they don't tend to do that unless they need to see over something, get something out of a tree, climb. So bears can walk on 2 legs and they can stand on 2 legs, but it really isn't their default mode of movement. Part of the reason is that their sight, their hearing, and their sense of smell are all better when they're on all 4s than they are when they're standing up. So, because it seemed that whatever had attacked their camp was walking on 2 legs, they discussed the possibility that it was a person, but it was really too dark to get a good look at the tracks, so it had to wait until the morning. But they didn't make it to morning, because at midnight, Bauman woke up to some strange noises around the camp, and he immediately grabbed his rifle and noticed that there was a scent of a wild beast, and then just outside their lean-to, the looming figure of some sort of large animal. So, doing what you would do in this situation, Bauman turned around and shot at it. Either he hit it and didn't kill it, or he missed it entirely because the thing just ran off into the darkness. When they awoke the next morning, Bauman and his companion, kind of on an unspoken agreement, decided that they weren't going to split up to check traps. They were just going to stick together for this one. So they went out, they checked their traps, didn't really find anything, not a huge deal, it had only been one night, and then headed back to camp. But upon heading back to camp, it was destroyed again. And once again, the tracks left by the assailant suggested that it was walking on 2 legs. Now, not really interested in personally encountering whatever was coming around their camp and destroying it every time they left, they decided that for that night, they were just going to construct the largest fire possible and take shifts sleeping, and one person would watch the fire. And that is what they did. They kept the fire going all night, and as they did so, Bauman says that they heard something across the creek come down the ridge and just sit there kind of watching them. And he said that it sat there just gazing at them, pacing back and forth. Whatever it was, they couldn't really see, they could just hear it over there for about an hour, and he believed that it may have been kept at bay by the very, very large fire. And Bauman said that they could hear it making harsh, grating, long-drawn moans, something he described as a particularly sinister sound. So remember, these are experienced hunters. These are men who know what cougars and bears and wolves sound like. And to Bauman, this did not match. Whatever was over there making noises at them, it was not a typical animal. And we can extrapolate from the fact that when looking at the tracks, Bauman could not be sure it was a bear, that maybe those tracks looked a little bit different from normal bear tracks as well. In any case, when morning came, they decided they were done with this area, they did not want to be involved in it anymore. The hunter who had died a year prior was enough bad juju. They were going to head out that afternoon after they collected their traps. So they went about checking everything and found almost all of them empty. And Bauman says that as they walked, as they hiked around checking their materials, they felt like something was watching them, that they would hear branches snap, pine needles rustle. Just, it felt like they were being stalked by something. But by noon, they had collected all but 3 traps, and Bauman volunteered to go down and check those traps, while his partner went back and packed up camp. So that's what they did. They split up. But Bauman came across a beaver and sat down and prepped it for travel, so skinned it and cleaned it and all that. And then by the time he'd done that, a couple more hours had passed, and he realized that the sun was starting to get kind of low in the sky, and he really should head back to camp. And as he traveled back, he remarked how quiet the woods were, that there was no more snapping of branches, no more sounding like something was stalking him, just it was dead silent. And dead silence in the forest typically suggests the presence of some form of apex predator. When he eventually came across camp and it was in view, the fire was out and some stuff was still laying around, and there was just a thin trail of blue smoke headed up into the sky. So he called out for his partner, but he got no response. And then, making his way into camp, he sadly found his partner laying dead on the ground next to a fallen spruce tree. He had a broken neck, but along with that, he had 4 deep fang marks in his neck. And on top of all of that, the body was still warm, which meant that the killing had happened sometime in the past few hours. And due to the man's position, it seemed like the attack had come from behind, like something had just snuck up behind him, grabbed his neck, and left him to die there. Which, silent attack from behind suggests a cougar, but why would the cougar just leave the body there? Why not drag it off? On top of the strange behavior of a mountain lion to kill something and then not take it home to eat, the tracks around the area still suggested this was a bipedal creature. This was something walking on 2 legs. And not to put too fine a point on it, but a mountain lion typically will drag its prey off to its den and eat it there, and a bear will typically eat something on the spot and then drag off the remains or even just leave them there. So the fact that the body was still there intact, aside from the broken neck and the fang marks, really doesn't make sense. Following this entire experience, Bauman decided that it was time to get out of Dodge, got out of there, hopped on his horse, and never went back. But how true was the story? And why did Roosevelt include it in his book? He seems skeptical at the very beginning, almost as if it's a whimsical tale that's being told to him, even though it's got very dark subject matter. Had Roosevelt experienced something similar? Was this his way of telling a story that actually happened to him? Is it something he believed? We can't say for certain, but it's interesting enough that he included it. Roosevelt was a guy who spent a lot of time on the frontier, a lot of time hunting, and interacted on many occasions with Native American tribes and likely knew quite a bit about their folklore. Maybe he actually did think Bauman's story could be true. Or maybe he was just showing it as a cautionary tale of how people can encounter wildlife, think they can handle it, and then something so strange it just has to be supernatural happens. And it's something that you could feasibly write off if not for the fact that there are so many Native American legends about Bigfoot. You know, some of these legends come to us through Jesuits and Spanish explorers. For example, Spanish and Mexican explorers in California told of dark watchers, which were these figures that they saw watching them from up in the hills. Or the French Jesuits in Mississippi who came across things that were large and hairy and screamed and stole cattle. But what of the natives themselves? An early example of a depiction of a Bigfoot or a Sasquatch, something along those lines, comes from the Tool River Indian Reservation, which is in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada mountains. This site, called Painted Rock, depicts a number of humanoid figures, as well as several very hairy and unusually large figures. Now, to be clear, when it comes to art, something being larger does not always necessarily mean it's a depiction of scale. Often ancient cultures will use a larger figure to depict somebody of greater importance. A god might be larger than average people, even if they believed that the god would have been the same actual height. A pharaoh will sometimes appear twice as large as his court. Things like that. And with Painted Rock, the site is believed to be at least 500 years old and possibly even 2,000 years old. So, considering that, you know, it's very old, it kind of makes sense that you might have that sort of art scaling system, where you see something that is larger on the rock than it would be in real life. Or maybe they were really trying to depict something that was especially large and hairy. The local Yokut people call the largest figure the hairy man, and if this painting is really as old as anthropologists believe it to be, then it predates European colonialism. That means whatever they were depicting there, it wasn't depicting Europeans. It wasn't the monsterization, the monsterification of some invading force. This was something that was there already. And it kind of spans the continent. If you go over all the way to the east, the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois as we all know them, and I probably butchered the pronunciation, but I'm trying my best, had something that they referred to as stone giants, or in their language, the Genosqua. I'm trying, again, I don't know Native American languages very well. I apologize if I'm getting this wrong. Please tell me the correct pronunciation in the comments. And what I was able to find was a book by Anthony Wonderly called At the Front of the Marvelous, which is a discussion of, humanoid monsters and creatures from Native American folklore. And he describes what he called the friendly visitor narrative, which is common on a lot of East Coast and Northern Native American tribes. And in this narrative, the stone giant is described as humanoid with a pointed head, clothed in garments made of stone, and about twice the height of a man. It also possesses magical abilities like super strength, and in some stories they are sentient but unintelligent, so they're capable of, complex cognitive function, but they're just not very bright. They can live in tribes and move around in communities, and their stone garments keep them from being hurt. Now, we don't know exactly how old this legend is, but the compilation I'm referring to comes from about the year 1900. In the Friendly Neighbor narrative, the stone giant is a female, and she actually flees her husband and seeks help and refuge amongst the Iroquois. In exchange for their help in defeating her husband when he comes looking for her, she grants them gifts like luck and better skill at hunting and things like that. And in some versions of this story, the sexes of the giants are reversed, and it's the husband fleeing the wife. It doesn't seem to matter all that much. And to be clear, Anthony Wonderly compares the stone giant not to Sasquatch, but more to the Wendigo, which I think he might be off base with. I also think it might be possible that some of these stories about these stone giants who wear clothes made of stone that protect them from being hurt might possibly have a root more in European colonialism and the armor that early settlers would wear in combat than it does any sort of real monster, or it's possible they combined the two. But given the fact that they describe garments made of stone that deflect weapons, it does make me wonder if maybe they were encountering Europeans and the size just grew over time. But what we're really interested in here is not these close but no cigars versions, it's the actual term Sasquatch and where the origin of Bigfoot lies, and that is with the Coast Salish people. The Coast Salish and their neighbors in the Pacific Northwest and British Columbia had a term called sasq'et, or sasq'ets. And that became Sasquatch when a man named J.W. Burns, who was a Canadian journalist and teacher living on the reservation, requested some stories from people and then eventually wrote them down for publication in a Canadian newspaper. You see, Burns was living amongst a group called the Chehalis, and he could not totally get their trust, so they would tell him these stories. But after about 3 years of interacting with the community and proving himself to these people, he was able to get a few of them to talk to him about these experiences that many of the elders worried would just be used to mock natives. When Burns had attempted to speak to elders and not just members of the tribe who were willing to talk to him, he was told, "White man don't believe, he make joke of the Indian." So the natives were very concerned that this was just going to be used against them if they told him. Some of the members of the tribe who weren't in leadership positions, however, didn't necessarily share that sentiment, and one by the name of Peter, that was his Christian name, his English name, was willing to tell a pretty interesting story. Peter, in 1909, was bear hunting, and he came across a particularly large one perched on a rock. But when the creature that he was looking at turned and stood up to face him, he realized that that was not a bear, that was a very large and very hairy man. He said it was approximately 6 feet 6 inches tall, very burly, and that it was not happy to see him standing there with a rifle. He then claims that the man let out a piercing wail and charged him. Peter reported that the creature was faster than he was and closed the distance to 100 feet and then even just 50 feet by the time he was able to reach the river and jump into his canoe. The canoe carried him downriver quickly enough and out of harm's way, and he did recount to J.W. Burns that had he been of clearer mind, he probably could have turned around and just shot the thing, but he was in such a frantic panic that all he could think about was getting to safety. Peter made it home, locked himself indoors, instructed his family to hide, and then waited with his rifle by the door for the thing to show up. And some 20 minutes later, he saw it approaching from outside. He was scared to death, but he remained indoors, did not try to challenge the thing, as it just wailed on his walls trying to break into the house. And Peter is very clear in this story that this is a very tall and very bulky and very hairy man, that other than that, there really wasn't that much different about it appearance-wise. It was just very large. Eventually, it did get tired of banging on Peter's walls and just walked off, but the damage done to his place was so severe that he actually just abandoned it the following winter and constructed a new home. After it had walked away, Peter walked outside to, check around, inspect the damage, and see what he found. And what was interesting is that the footprints were like 22 inches long. But they weren't just absolutely massive normal human footprints, or even normal primate footprints. They were very narrow, proportionally to their length. Peter then encountered it again the following year, and when he spoke to the tribal elders about it, they seemed rather nonplussed. They were unsurprised. This was not something that was news to them. On the same day that Peter encountered it for the second time, another Native American named Paul also encountered the thing. And then on Peter's third encounter with the creature, he was actually with a companion bear hunting. In this case, they came across two of them, hunched over, nude, and he could tell that one of them was a male and one of them was a female. And interestingly, both of these ones were actually smaller than the one he had encountered. It's worth taking a minute to note that Native Americans, while on average about an inch taller than their European counterparts, are still on average under 6 feet tall. It is rare for a Native American person to be 6'6". And Peter was very careful when talking to J.W. Burns to explain that, in his opinion, these things were by no means related to the Native Americans, to the Indians. They were not of his tribe, they were not of his people, they were something different entirely, and he did not want them associated with his people. But Peter's not the only Native American that Burns managed to speak to. He found another guy by the name of Charlie Victor, and he had some stories as well. Once, Charlie and some of his companions were out hunting, and they came across a cave in a place that, as far as they were aware, there was no cave. They knew this forest like the back of their hand. They hunted in it, they fished in it, they trapped in it all the time. And this cave was not usually there. And on top of that, there was a boulder off to the side of it. So they went back and they told the elders what they had seen, and the elders told them that's where the Sasqu'ets live, don't go there. As you can imagine, they went there. But when he and his friends got back to the cave, what they found was that there was once again no cave, and the boulder seemed to have been rolled in front of where the cave entrance had been. Charlie then went on to tell some of the others in the tribe, and many people recounted that they had similar stories of things that just didn't quite make sense to them. And on one unfortunate occasion, Charlie actually claims to have shot one. He was bear hunting, as many of the natives of the region did, and about 7 feet up in a tree, there was a hollow, and he stuck his dog into the hollow to go root out what he believed was probably just a black bear, and what came charging out of the tree was not a black bear. Instead, it was a humanoid, and he shot it because he assumed it was going to be a bear, and he didn't want the bear to get the chance to get him first. Upon realizing that it was, in fact, not a bear, but rather what appeared to be a European boy, freaked out a little bit. And according to Charlie, the boy appeared white with long, woolly black hair, around 14 or 15 years old. And then the boy cried out what he described as a wild yell that was answered in kind from somewhere else in the forest. What Charlie described was a long, booming voice which grew nearer every time he heard it. The boy would shout, and he would get a shout in return, and with each shout, whatever he was calling out to got a little bit closer. So Charlie perceived that, oh, he's calling for help. He's guiding something here. Now, Charlie, to his credit, decided to stick around and keep an eye on the boy, and in a little under 30 minutes, whatever he was calling out to appeared. And what he describes is a woman, her face almost black, and her long straight hair fell to her waist. And according to him, she was about 6 feet tall and very above average in the size of her chest and shoulders. And Charlie told Burns that he had met wild people before, but this was something entirely different. This was not a person. But the creature spoke to him in the language of the Douglas people, another Native American group. Charlie himself was half Douglas, so he was speaking the language back, and what she said to him was, "You have shot my friend." And then when he explained the accident and how it actually occurred, she told him, "You'll never kill another bear." Warning, threat, prophecy, who really knows? According to Charlie, after this, he never shot another animal. He then claims that she did some form of ritual dance, throwing around what at first he thought was a snake, but then realized might be the intestines of another animal, picked the boy up easily with one arm, and carried him off into the woods. But apparently, as she was doing her dance around him and then picking him up, she was chanting something that he described as Yahoo, and that she chanted it over and over, and what he heard was the same form of the same word-ish thing, the same vocalization, returning to their location from other points in the forest. Charlie also believed that the boy that he shot wasn't one of these sasq'ets because he was referred to as my friend, not my son, not my brother, no familial terms which would typically be used to describe somebody of the same tribe. That perhaps this boy had been adopted into the Sasquatch tribe, which is interesting because in many missing 411 cases that involve children who are found alive, they report that they were carried off or cared for by a large hairy man. But unlike Peter, Charlie believed that these Sasquatches might be related to his own people, that they might be just Native Americans living off in the woods who had different customs. And then there's a final story in Burns' account that comes from a man named Point. And what Point describes is that while berry picking, he and his companions came across something odd. According to Point, he and his friends came across a creature twice as big as the average man, with hands so long that they almost touched the ground, and with very large eyes and a wide, flat nose. A description that you might recognize from our skunk ape video when we talked about Tulkalu, the Cherokee Devil or the Bigfoot of the South. And in Point's account, once again, the elders were unsurprised, and they claimed that it was one of the Sasquatches, a tribe of people who lived off in the mountains in caves and tunnel systems. Which leads us to a very interesting question. When we hear about Bigfoot, when we see Bigfoot in media, it's typically a 8 to 10 foot tall, hairy ape creature. Sometimes it can talk, sometimes it can't, sometimes it's helpful, sometimes it's evil. But it doesn't really match Sasquatch. It doesn't match the Sasquatches. And while there certainly are Native American stories about a large humanoid creature, something of a forest god that protects the wilderness, the Sasquatches clearly aren't that. These early Sasquatch stories seem to be about something very much a physical creature or a physical group of people who live off in the wilderness. And in this case, a group of people who are abnormally large. So what are they? Are we dealing with a tribe of men? A tribe of near humans? Is this possibly a group of pre-Clovis culture human beings who were there before the people we know as Native Americans and survived off in the mountains? It wouldn't be too surprising. We hear about mountain tribes from all sorts of different groups. Or could it be that some sort of natural disaster or sickness or a colonization attempt by a tribe to go somewhere else and form a new settlement went wrong and they got stuck and they were isolated and over time adapted to their new environment? Or is it possible that these are different hominids entirely, a subset of Homo sapiens, like Neanderthals or Denisovans, who aren't us, but could very well be our cousins? Is what we're dealing with here not some sort of undiscovered primate, but rather a different ethnic group of human beings who, through a very severe process of natural selection, have turned into something different from us? Is what we're dealing with here not Bigfoot, but feral people? And if what we're dealing with here is something more akin to a different tribe of people, or a different hominid group, or a divergent evolution of Homo sapiens sapiens, it might make sense that the reason we struggle to find DNA or bones or anything that definitively says, yeah, this is Bigfoot, could be because what we're looking for is not a separate primate, but rather human beings who just have adapted to look different, sound different, and be different, live in different places. And if we transition from a belief that Bigfoot's an undiscovered primate, something larger than us, something even perhaps magical, to just a different group of human beings, does it make it more likely that the Sasquatches are a real thing? That Bigfoot, not as the giant hairy ape of the wilderness, but as a very, very, very uncivilized tribe of men, make more sense? Is that more possible? It's up to you to decide, and we're curious what you guys think. So please let us know in the comments. Do you think that these Sierra camp tapes caught Bigfoot? Do you think that the actual Bigfoot is just these Sasquatches referred to by Native American elders? Or is it just all nonsense? We're curious what you think. And if you want to support what we're doing here at the Lore Lodge, you can subscribe to us on Patreon for just $1 a month. You can also check out our podcast where we talk about all this stuff, but we do it live, and Aiden wears a hat, and you can see him and hear his voice instead of having him be, over in the corner just watching me with lust in his eyes.
The emotions never stop. They're borderline uncontrollable by the end of these videos.
Oh my god. Those are on Sunday nights at 7 p.m., and then they go up on all podcast platforms. I'm not going to pretend it's consistently, but I'm trying to get better. You can also check out our Amazon storefront. You can check us out on our other social media platforms. I stream on Twitch, where we do reaction content and play video games. And we, of course, have our various sponsorships and brand deals that you can see in the link tree in the description. And, of course, most importantly, our coffee, Mount Pocono Perk from Tableau Roasting Company in Kentucky. It is phenomenal. You've got to try it. I guarantee if you get one bag, you will switch over to it. It will be your go-to coffee, and it's really not that expensive. So, check it out. And with all that said, I'm Aiden Mattis, and thanks for stopping by the Lore Lodge.